votes and left Florida with a reputation as not just the quintessential swing state, but also a bellwether state that would predict how the election as a whole would go. And over the next few elections, it did, voting for Republicans, Democrats, then Republicans, then Republicans again, even though a Democrat won the election that year. And in the 2022 elections, which were sort of disappointing for Republicans overall, Florida would re-elect its Republican governor, Ron DeSantis, in a landslide.
Biggest win for a Republican governor in this state here in modern history.
Republicans would also win 2/3 supermajorities in both houses of the state's legislature. And Florida Republicans have been busy.
Banning transgender girls from female sports.
So-called Don't Say Gay law.
Stop Woke Act bans race-related concepts.
Bill that would ban abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy.
What used to be a swing state is now deeply conservative.
It's gotten even redder since the last election.
Is Florida now a solid red state?
Florida. I love this state.
Today, the idea of Florida as a swing state feels like a distant memory. So what changed? So in this video, we're going to look at 3 explanations for why Florida turned red. But first, we should look at what turned red really means in this case, because even though Florida has swung in presidential elections, for the past 20 years, every governor it's elected has been a Republican. Same with every attorney general it's elected. This chart, which shows how Florida's voted in the past 6 presidential elections, seems to show a lot of variation. Republicans win some years, Democrats win others. But stay with me, if you add how the whole country voted onto this chart and compare that with Florida, you see that in every election, Florida voted more Republican than the country in general. And if you just chart the gap between Florida and the US, that looks like this. And what we're interested in is this. This big jump, where Florida goes from voting about 3 or 4 percentage points more Republican than the country to 8 percentage points more Republican. The vicinity of about 2020. Anyone remember anything about that year? Between the beginning of the pandemic and the 2022 midterm elections, about 4 million registered voters in the US moved to a new state. About 1 out of every 7 of those voters ended up in Florida. That's a lot. And if we look at what political party those new Florida voters are now registered to, we see a lot more Republicans than Democrats. And you can really see that if we compare it to the other states that also got a lot of new residents during the pandemic. So Georgia, California, North Carolina, Texas. There is an outlier here. That is a lot of Republicans moving to Florida during the pandemic. So that's our first explanation. And it's definitely one that conservatives have highlighted.
A lot of people leave these other states and come to Florida because of the policies of the state legislature.
Lockdowns have driven some people to Florida who just had enough.
Florida's policies were not nearly as restrictive as they were in New York and California. People remember that.
But this story actually only gets us part of the way there, because this margin is about 100,000 people. That's a lot, but in 2022, about 8 million people voted in Florida. Those new voters, not enough to really swing an election. So we need to keep looking. This is Miami-Dade County, the biggest county in Florida and one of the most left-leaning. In 2016, it voted for Hillary Clinton by about 30 percentage points. In 2018, the Democratic candidate for governor won it by about 20 points. Then in 2020, Joe Biden only won the county by about 7 points. And in 2022, the Republican candidate for governor won in Miami-Dade County. This is a pretty big shift. But if we look at who lives in Miami-Dade, there's a clue. Nationally, Latino voters have mostly voted for Democrats in recent elections. And they also used to in Florida, which is about a quarter Latino, but not anymore. In 2022, the state's Latino voters went firmly for Republicans. Latinos in Florida are voting more Republican than before and voting more Republican than Latinos elsewhere in the U.S. These are the 7 states with the largest Latino populations in the U.S. Together, they make up 2/3 of the country's Latino population. And here is how those populations break down in terms of what the U.S. Census calls specific origin. You can see 2 trends here. In the Southwest and Midwest, Latino populations are mostly Mexican. In the Northeast, they're more Puerto Rican and Dominican. But Florida is a whole different story. with not just a large Cuban population, but sizable and growing populations from Venezuela and Colombia. And Republicans have gone after those communities hard, with messaging like this ad from 2022.
Como un inmigrante colombiano, Florida representa la base donde todos entramos a este país con el sueño americano.
Or this ad from 2020,
Progresista.
which linked Joe Biden to the socialist leaders of the countries many Floridians have come from.
I'm going to be good to go down as one of the most progressive presidents in American history.
And you can see what might be the success of that approach if you zoom into Miami-Dade to, for example, the city of Hialeah, which is about 75% Cuban. They have voted for Democrats at a lower and lower rate since 2016. Or the city of Doral, which is majority Venezuelan and Colombian. Same thing.
For whom I vote? Republican, of course.
Coming from Cuba, we all know what communism and socialism looks like.
Donald Trump's, the values he stands for me, it's the same values I share.
Kamala, she's horrible. She is socialist.
Now, there's also been speculation that disinformation among Spanish-speaking Floridians played a role in 2020 and 2022, but that is kind of hard to quantify. Anyway, this chart kind of offers a simpler explanation. It shows us Republican spending on Spanish-language advertising in the 2022 governor's race compared to how much Democrats spent. You might interpret this gap as one side was going much harder than the other side. You wouldn't be wrong. Here is a kind of similar chart. This one shows all the money spent by the state parties in Florida since 2021. At the peak of the last election, Florida Republicans spent more than $60 million in a single quarter. Democrats spent a little less than $8 million. And get used to seeing big red bars, because it's hard to overstate how strong Florida's state Republican Party is. It's the best funded state party in the country, and it's not even really close. In 2022, the Republican Party of Florida raised over $140 million. Florida Democrats raised $27 million. Especially compared to Florida Republicans, Florida Democrats are in bad shape. Florida has always had more registered Democrats than registered Republicans, but that ended in 2021. And not only that, there's actually a third group that's not far behind: registered voters with no party affiliation. If we just look at the new voter registrations since 2020, that group actually outnumbers registrations for both parties. Now let's separate it out by age. Look at how many younger people in Florida are registering as no party. Those are voters that the Florida Democratic Party is just missing. When the 2022 election results came in, it wasn't just Governor DeSantis who won in a landslide. Senator Marco Rubio and the Republican candidate for Attorney General ran up similar margins.
It's just a bloodbath. Boom, boom, boom.
One of the worst midterm elections for Democrats in decades.
It really cannot be overstated how poorly Democrats performed.
Look at how many people are here to see Ron DeSantis. Look at this.
I love him. We love him. We need him in Florida.
Great to be here, gathered in the red county of Miami-Dade.